Earlier this year in April 2018, I did my trilogy of reviews for Eco, Shadow of the Colossus and The Last Guardian. Hope you enjoyed them. I actually thought about doing this epilogue video to primarily discuss the subtracting design or design through subtraction approach in the games, and how I personally interpret it and connect the three games. At the same time, I have thought more about the games and done some research, to the point of wondering if my reviews should have been not for experienced gamers, but the non-gamer audience game designer Fumito Ueda was targeting. I thought the games should have been for experienced gamers, based on the frustrations involved during gameplay, as well as the controls to an extent. But more on that later. If anything, this is to expand on the reviews in the form of a retrospective. First of all, what is the subtracting design approach? Broadly speaking, it refers to removing, quote, every element of the game that took away from its reality, end quote. Okay, let's analyze this further, starting with Eco. Originally starting development on the first PlayStation system, game designer Fumito Ueda came up with the boy meets girl concept and wanted to keep the vision intact from the game's development up until release. The only setting of Eco is the castle, and all the player has to do is escape from it. There is also only one enemy type, the shadow creatures, who are picked apart with a mostly simplistic combat system. Those of you who have played a large number of games from the beginning of the industry to the present day will surely have noticed that games tend to have a variety of settings and enemy types, with the purpose of holding a player's interest. For example, the Mario and Banjo-Kazooie games have a variety of level types such as grass, fire, water, ice and so on, plus a variety of enemies to hinder the player. Eco is not like these. In fact, it was made to be a game unlike any other. It is easy to simply replace the words subtracting design with minimalism. I argue that the minimalism adds to the potential immersion. Films, for example, can be quite immersive when done well. If game staples were shown on the celluloid screen, such as a health bar, inventory icons or numbers, then it would be distracting. Unless that was an artistic decision? Eco was meant to be like a film, and the deliberate inclusion to not include a HUD makes the game more cinematic, as well as less confusing for those who would play the game. You only see the characters and settings, which are only made better by the great textures and lighting, plus a camera that not only gives indications of how and where to utilize the gameplay mechanics to progress, but also make the player feel something, such as awe, dread, isolation, hope and so on, like any good amount of camera work should do. The decision not to have subtitles for the dialogue of the girl Yorda was also, quote, critical to the physical contact and holding hands concept that the two not be able to communicate and talk to each other all the time during gameplay, end quote. Does the game Shadow of the Colossus follow this approach? Yes, but to a different extent. Designer Fumito Ueda wanted to try something original, and Sony wanted to market it more heavily after the weak sales of Eco. How this was achieved is subjective, especially given that gamers who may have played so many games before probably never played Eco, despite its small following and critical acclaim. With the on-screen device for controls and an HUD that displays health bars, a stamina gauge, as well as your weapon of choice, is Shadow of the Colossus a game for gamers? What else could make it a game for gamers? Maybe it's the deliberate order in which you have to overcome the challenges or defeat the colossi to complete the game. Maybe it's the use of a weak point on a colossus that has to be exposed, as is the case with most boss battles in games. Maybe it's the concept of upgrading your health and stamina bars. Don't forget, the concept of upgrading was barely featured in Eco. But in regards to what is barely featured, the lands of Shadow of the Colossus are deliberately desolate. Usually in large games that feature an open world, towns with people, or technically NPCs, are featured, which, when done right, can make for compelling world building as well as potentially help the player, or at least give them some direction. Generally outside of these towns are a hopefully eclectic bunch of enemies to fight, to gain experience or upgrades, or at least hold a player's attention. And let's not forget the potential awe of a new world or the variety of items you can find. But Shadow of the Colossus doesn't really have any of this. While the few characters of the game may generally know what's going on in the game's world, we, the player, don't. The relationship between Wanda and the girl Mono, as well as why the land is forbidden, are generally ambiguous. No town locals to explain or clarify things to us, just an entity that gives Wanda the quest to destroy the 16 beasts, with the beam of your sword being your only guide. Similarly to Eco, the environment is key to solving the puzzles, which generally involves figuring out a Colossus' weak point. Whether the boss rush aspect of the game combined with occasionally stopping to find upgrades through fruit and lizards, or perhaps even taking a breather to admire the scenery, would appeal to someone is up to them. The subtracting design approach applies to the setting and the game's quest. I seemingly implied in my review that The Last Guardian is a combination of the previous two games, which is certainly true. Even designer Fumito Ueda teased us about this combination, right down to the subtracting design approach. First of all, the setting is vast, yet quiet, right down to the relative lack of music. The only characters that are generally seen, without spoiling you the story, are the boy and the creature Trico, and the game is about them connecting, nothing else. Again, there is barely anyone to talk to. Much like Eco, there is a one-note kind of enemy. The heavily armoured guards, and the way to beat them is essentially simplistic. In fact, it can be argued that The Last Guardian shares more similarities with Eco than Shadow of the Colossus, with the latter only lending its use of giant beasts, as well as use of HUDs and on-screen button prompts, which are used sparingly. The reasoning for this are the more enclosed spaces that are somewhat reminiscent of the castle from the first Team Eco game, as well as environmental puzzles involving levers and picking up items as well as pushing or pulling them. Trico has a, shall we say, more advanced AI than Eco's companion Yorda in regards to doing things on its own, even when you call it. This is similar to the connection between Wanda and the horse Akko in Shadow of the Colossus, the only difference being that those two know and are loyal to each other. It is telling that this was the inspiration for The Last Guardian because players felt connected to the horse more than the girl. Interesting. So, what is my interpretation of the subtracting design approach? Does it work? Was it consistent through all three games? Well, whether it worked and perhaps affected you is up to you, but it's definitely consistent. When it comes to the gameplay, this approach certainly makes for a more understandable or straightforward premise. Again, probably for non-gamers. Escape the castle, defeat 16 creatures, escape the valley, all with the aid of a companion. That's it. You see levers, ladders, blocks, creatures and so on, and interact them in a generally simplistic way. How you do it, and in what order, however, is what makes for the solving environmental puzzles aspect of the games. When it comes to the story, either the general good versus evil premise seen in video games could potentially be undermined by characters, settings, ideas and so on that can be interpreted as superfluous or detracting. What is the purpose of that character? Why is there this other setting that doesn't resemble what may have been an understandable or relatable world in the first place? What's that doing there? What's the point? Think about those questions. Perhaps they are more relevant when discussing story-driven games. Perhaps they are more relevant when discussing books, films and so on, mediums that have lasted longer than video games and are therefore held in higher regard as an art form. Well, here's another question. Are Eco, Shadow of the Colossus and The Last Guardian video games? Well, they do feature jumping, puzzle solving, combat, even upgrading stats, but they are different. The Banjo-Kazooie games, for example, feature a variety of settings, again with grass, fire, etc., though they do feel connected by an overworld such as Gruntilda's Lair or the Isle of Hags. A great number of games that deliberately feature a variety of location types aren't always connected like that. But would those games have been better if the world felt more like some landmass perhaps? Surely not. But would the Team Eco games have been better if there were more enemy or location types? Oh look, there's a volcano/fire level in Eco. Just kidding, there's not. That's hard to answer because the subtracting design approach would certainly have had an effect on me. An effect that is almost hard to describe. But I'll try to anyway. The only way I can begin to wrap this up is by making the broad statement that video games can be art, and these 3 video games are a good example of that. I actually cried while playing these games, and if the emotion doesn't prove that point, I don't know what does. It is hard to deny the games can be frustrating in areas, to the point where you have to wonder if the games are trying to be artful and neglect gameplay. But that's not necessarily true. The gameplay and story and setting and premise are purely where the subtracting design approach lies. It feels somewhat refreshing to play games where there aren't any superfluous or superficial elements, and it's all focused and coherent. This is a good way to target non-gamers where too much information, control functions, content and so on are potentially alienating. But I'm still somewhat unsure if the 3 games are good for that audience. For one, I wish for less frustration and maybe a bit more variety and length with these games. But Fumito Ueda designed these games with the aforementioned approach in mind, and for the most part, it works. It's debatable in its appeal, especially for the mainstream, but these 3 games are simply unforgettable as a result.